The old fluorescent tube above the main bay of Vance Automotive gave a final, weary flicker before surrendering to darkness, plunging Elias Vance into the frigid gloom of the late afternoon. He didn't need the light to know the landscape of his failure. He could feel it in the biting cold that seeped through the thin walls of the garage, in the ache of his knuckles, raw and split from wrestling with a rusted engine block that would never run again. His breath plumed in the air, a ghost of the hope he was losing. On his small, cluttered desk, beneath the weight of a heavy wrench, lay the third and final notice from the bank. The paper was stark, its bold red letters a declaration of war he could not win. Foreclosure. The word felt like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. Across the oil-stained concrete floor, his 7-year-old daughter Maya sat at a makeshift desk he'd built from scrap wood. She was bundled in a puffy pink coat and a hat with floppy ears, her small fingers diligently guiding a crayon across a piece of paper. She was drawing a picture of them, 2 smiling stick figures standing in front of the garage, the sun a brilliant yellow circle in the corner. An innocent, powerful lie. The sun hadn't truly shone on them in a long time. Elias's heart clenched. He was a good mechanic, an honest man. But goodness and honesty didn't pay the bills. They didn't keep the cold out or put more than beans and rice on the table. He was failing her. That single, desperate thought was the engine of his quiet agony. The sudden purr of a high-end engine, smooth and powerful, sliced through the silence. It was a sound that didn't belong in Northwood, a town that ran on rust and prayer. Elias looked up as a gleaming black sedan, sleek as a panther, rolled to a stop just outside his open garage door. The town's curtain twitchers would be in heaven. A woman emerged from the driver's side, tall and poised, dressed in a cashmere coat that likely cost more than his entire business. He recognized her from town. She was the talk of the diner, the mysterious heiress who'd been staying at the old inn, Serafina Sterling. She walked into the garage, her expensive heels clicking on the grimy floor. Her eyes, a startling shade of gray, scanned the space, taking in the dying light, the cold, the look of a place on its last legs. A few neighbors, feigning casual strolls, had already gathered at a safe distance, their curiosity a palpable force. Serafina stopped before him, her expression unreadable. "You're Elias Vance," she stated, not a question. He wiped his hands on an old rag, a reflexive gesture of dignity. "I am." She gestured vaguely at the opulent car. "I have a problem, and I'm told you're the man who can fix anything." Before he could answer, Brenda from next door called out, her voice dripping with saccharine malice. "He can't even fix his own finances, dearie." A few cruel chuckles followed. Serafina's gaze didn't waver from his. She ignored them completely. Then, in a voice clear and loud enough for everyone to hear, she made the most absurd, most insulting proposition he had ever heard. "I need a husband," she announced. "For 9 months. A temporary arrangement. In exchange, I will pay off this garage, your house, all of it. I will set you and your daughter up for life." A wave of stunned silence was followed by a ripple of mocking laughter. "Hear that, Elias?" someone shouted. "Rich girl wants to rent a husband." The humiliation was a hot brand on his skin. He felt his fists clench. But then he saw Maya, peeking out from behind her desk, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. He saw his own reflection in her gaze. A desperate man being offered a lifeline, however thorny. His anger cooled, replaced by a deep, weary resolve. His integrity was the only true thing he had left to give his daughter. He took a slow breath, the cold air burning his lungs. He looked directly at Serafina, his voice low but steady, carrying in the charged silence. "Ma'am," he began, his tone quiet but firm, cutting through the jeers. "My life isn't a line item on a budget. My dignity is not for sale, and my love for my daughter is not a commodity you can purchase." The crowd hushed, surprised. Serafina's perfect composure faltered, a flicker of shock in her gray eyes. He pressed on, his words not for the gossips, but for her. "If you're in some kind of trouble, real trouble, and you need a good man's help, then we can talk about that. But not like this. Not for a paycheck. His reply hung in the air, freezing the moment. The mockery died on the neighbor's lips, replaced by a grudging, confused respect. He had turned her power back on her, not with anger, but with principle. Serafina Sterling, the millionaire heiress who could buy anything, had just been told she couldn't buy him. She stared at him, truly seeing him for the first time, not as a charity case, but as a man of unshakable substance. Her mask of cool indifference crumbled, revealing a flicker of raw vulnerability. "I am," she whispered, her voice suddenly fragile. "I am in trouble." Later, after the curious onlookers had dispersed, grumbling about the lack of a dramatic climax, she explained. They sat in his small, clean office, a space heater waging a losing battle against the encroaching night. Her story was one of corporate sharks and familial betrayal. Her late grandfather, a titan of industry with an old-fashioned worldview, had stipulated in his will that she could only assume control of his company, Sterling Industries, if she were in a stable, settled marriage. It was a morality clause designed to protect his legacy from what he saw as her flighty, modern lifestyle. Her uncle, a man she described as having a soul of rust, was using the clause to stage a hostile takeover, poised to gut the company and sell it for parts. "Why me?" Elias asked, the question hanging between them. "I've been in town for a month," she confessed, looking at her manicured hands. "I've been watching. I saw you at the market, letting Mrs. Gable go ahead of you even though you were in a hurry. I saw you spend an hour helping a teenager fix his bicycle chain for free. I saw the way you look at your daughter," her voice softened. "My world is filled with men who would sell their souls for $1. I needed to find one who wouldn't." They forged a new agreement. Not a transaction, but a partnership. He would be her husband on paper, a shield of respectability to fulfill the clause. In return, she would use her resources to save his business. Not as a handout, but as an investment, a partner's contribution. It was a pact built on mutual need and a fragile, burgeoning respect. He would help her save her legacy, and she would help him save his. The first tremor of their new reality hit 2 days later. Mr. Gable, a man whose smile never reached his predatory eyes, swaggered into the garage. He'd seen Serafina's car, heard the whispers. He reeked of cheap cologne and avarice. Well, Vance," he sneered, waving a sheaf of papers. "Looks like you found yourself a sugar mama. That's good, because the grace period is over. Payment in full. Now." Elias stood his ground. "We have an arrangement." "Your arrangement is with me," Gable snapped. "And I'm calling the loan due." The town turned on him with a quiet, vicious certainty. He was no longer the noble poor man. He was a sellout. The parents at Maya's school whispered as he passed. The owner of the diner served him his coffee with a look of contempt. He was a kept man, a disgrace. Through it all, he bore the scorn silently, a shield for Serafina, who was unused to such naked prejudice. He saw the hurt in her eyes when people looked away from her, and he found himself defending her, explaining the goodness he was beginning to see beneath her polished armor. Their shared isolation forged a bond between them, a small island in a sea of judgment. Serafina, in turn, began to thaw. She spent her afternoons in the garage, ostensibly to keep up appearances, but soon she was genuinely engaged. She learned the names of the tools, listened to his stories about cars and the people who drove them. She saw the pride he took in his work, the artistry in his calloused hands. She started reading stories to Maya while Elias finished up, her voice losing its boardroom stiffness and finding a gentle rhythm. The three of them began to feel less like a contract and more like a constellation. One evening, while a pot of stew simmered on the stove in Elias's small, warm kitchen, Serafina was idly dusting the mantelpiece. She picked up a small, silver-framed photograph. It was a picture of a smiling young woman with kind eyes and a familiar warmth. "She's beautiful," Serafina said softly. "My Lena," Elias said, his voice thick with a grief that never truly faded. "Maya's mom." Serafina froze, her fingers tightening on the frame. Her breath caught. "Lena, Vance?" she whispered, her face pale. She was a nurse at St. Jude's Hospital, wasn't she? Elias nodded, confused by her reaction. Yes. How did you know? Tears welled in Serafina's eyes. My mother. She spent her last few months there. It was a terrible time. The doctors were clinical, my family was distant. But there was one nurse who treated her with such incredible grace. She'd sit and talk with her for hours, hold her hand, tell her stories about her husband, a brilliant mechanic who could fix anything, and their little girl. She looked from the photo to Elias, her expression one of dawning, earth-shattering realization. That nurse was Lena. She was the only person who showed my mother true kindness at the end. I never forgot her name. The revelation settled over the room, profound and absolute. This wasn't a random contract. It was a debt of kindness being repaid across the years. A cosmic circle closing. Serafina wasn't just saving a stranger. She was helping the family of the woman who had comforted her dying mother. Their partnership was no longer about business or appearances. It was sacred. Their newfound connection was immediately put to the test. Gable, enraged by their defiance and emboldened by the town's silent approval of his crusade, returned with a vengeance. He'd found a legal loophole, an obscure clause in the loan agreement, and had convinced a judge to expedite the foreclosure. He stood at the garage door, a smug grin on his face, flanked by a grim-faced sheriff's deputy. 24 hours, Vance, Gable declared triumphantly. You have 24 hours to produce the full amount, or this place is mine by sunrise tomorrow. The amount was impossible, a figure designed to crush him completely. Serafina immediately pulled out her checkbook, her pen poised. Elias, no. This ends now. I'll write the check. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a sad, resolute fire. He gently placed his hand over hers, stopping her. No, Serafina, he said, his voice quiet but unbreakable. This was his final test. We made a deal, partnership. If I let you just pay this away, then I become the man they all think I am. I'd be taking a handout. My name, my daughter's name, would be worth nothing in this town ever again. He looked around at the garage, his sanctuary and his prison. I'd rather lose it the right way than keep it the wrong way. It was a devastating choice. It was ruin, but it was integrity. He was choosing his soul over his survival. And in that moment, Serafina looked at him not just with respect, but with awe. She saw the legacy of Lena's goodness living in him, and she knew what she had to do. The next morning dawned gray and unforgiving. Gable arrived precisely at 8, the deputy in tow, ready to serve the final eviction papers. The few neighbors who'd gathered to watch the downfall of Elias Vance wore solemn, almost regretful expressions. But just as Gable stepped forward, a low rumble echoed down the street. It grew louder, resolving into the sound of multiple heavy engines. A convoy of vehicles turned the corner, gleaming work trucks, a flatbed carrying industrial equipment, and several rugged SUVs. They pulled up in a formidable line, blocking the entrance to the garage. The doors of the vehicles opened, and a group of men and women emerged. They were not corporate suits. They were tough, capable-looking people in steel-toed boots and work jackets bearing the logo of Sterling Industries. Serafina stepped out from the lead vehicle, her cashmere coat replaced by a practical jacket. She was no longer a visiting heiress. She was a commander. Gable, she said, her voice ringing with cold authority. You're trespassing. He scoffed. I have a court order. This property is mine. Not anymore, Serafina countered. She gestured to the crew behind her. Meet my board of directors. Not the vultures my uncle has been courting, but the real heart of my grandfather's company. The engineers, the foremen, the people who actually build things. She turned to Elias, a brilliant, triumphant smile on her face. Elias, we're not just saving your garage. We're investing in it. A man with a grizzled beard and kind eyes stepped forward and handed a certified cashier's check to the stunned deputy. It was for the full amount of the debt. Consider the Vance loan settled, he said, then looked Gable up and down with disdain. Now get off our property. Gable sputtered. his face turning a blotchy red, but the deputy, seeing the official check and the sheer force of the group before him, simply shrugged and escorted the fuming debt collector away. The onlookers gasped. Serafina addressed them, her voice carrying over the stunned silence. Sterling Industries is proud to announce its new regional expansion, beginning with a significant investment in Northwood. Our first project will be the creation of a state-of-the-art automotive and industrial service center. She put a hand on Elias's shoulder. In partnership with its founder and chief operator, Mr. Elias Vance. The impact was seismic. The town's salvation hadn't come from a government grant or a distant corporation. It had come because of the character of the very man they had scorned. The reward cascade was overwhelming. The Sterling crew, loyal to Serafina and the memory of her grandfather, swarmed the garage. They weren't just renovating, they were transforming it. New lifts, diagnostic computers, and pristine equipment were unloaded from the flatbed. Plans were unrolled on the hood of a truck, showing an expansion that would triple the garage's size and create 24 new jobs. The town's vindication was swift and total. The mayor, who hadn't given Elias the time of day for years, rushed over to shake his hand, babbling about civic pride. Brenda from next door brought over a freshly baked pie, her eyes downcast in shame. People didn't just see a mechanic anymore. They saw a hero, a man whose quiet decency had literally rebuilt their future. But for Elias, the true victory wasn't in the town's fickle admiration or the gleaming new equipment. It was in the circle of people now standing with him in the middle of his garage. It was Serafina, who looked at him with a depth of feeling that went far beyond their contract. It was Maya, laughing as one of the burly foremen lifted her up to see the new signs being made. It was the Sterling crew, who shook his hand and told him they were honored to work with a man their boss spoke of so highly. This was his new family, forged not by blood, but by integrity and a kindness that had echoed through time. 6 months later, spring had chased the last of the brutal winter from Northwood. The sign outside the bustling business now read Sterling and Vance Automotive. The air inside was warm, filled with the hum of a successful enterprise and the easy laughter of its employees. All local hires. Elias stood watching, his hands stained with the honest grease of a business he had built twice. Once with his labor, and again with his character. Serafina was sitting with Maya on a bench, the 9-month contract a forgotten relic of a past that seemed a lifetime ago. She was staying. They were partners in every sense of the word. He looked at his hands, no longer raw and aching from desperation, but strong and capable. He knew then that true wealth was never about the money you have, but about the character you refuse to sell. It was the only currency that could truly buy you a future.